So this is the first of 5 virtual seminars in which we will explore global migration and refugees through a foreign policy lens, including the social, political, and economic impacts of these issues. Before we officially kick off our series, Tarian and I want to go over a couple of brief logistics with you. So first of all, you'll notice that we're recording this session. All of the sessions will be recorded and will be posted up online, both on the Gilman Scholarship website, as well as the seminar digital toolbox, which we will talk about later. So you're welcome to share the recording with friends. If you're unable to make a session, the recording will be available.
If you have any questions, either about the series itself or about any of the content that we review in the series, please feel free to drop those questions in the chat. We will do our best to respond to the chat during the seminar itself. If we're unable to answer your questions now, however, we'll be logging them and we'll be able to send them out in a seminar Q&A after the session. So please be on the lookout for that in your email inboxes.
We know that it can be hard to connect to each other in these virtual spaces, that they sometimes feel impersonal. And we're going to really try over the course of the series to create opportunities for you all to connect with each other and to build a community of folks interested in refugee issues, a community of Gilman scholars and alum. And as part of that effort, we invite you to turn on your cameras so that we can all see each other and feel a bit more connected. We will be using breakout groups later today, and we ask that if you're able to, please turn on your cameras during that period as well.
We also encourage you to use the chat for your questions, but not only your questions for speakers, as we mentioned, but also as an additional way to communicate with each other.
And to that end, if you haven't done so already, as people were joining, we invited you to let us know a little bit about who you are. So please continue. If you haven't, to introduce yourself, tell us your name, if you held a Gilman scholarship, when you held that scholarship, and where you went with it. And if you did not hold a Gilman scholarship, tell us something else fun about yourself. And then finally, our final piece of logistics is that, again, I know these Zoom seminars can be challenging. And so I want to encourage you and invite you to close your other windows, shut down your email, put your phone on silence, and really allow yourself time to be present in this space, right? We all know that there are lots of things going on, right? There always are. And we really hope that you use this as a time for you to focus on your own learning and growth. I think we really don't allow ourselves to do that often, and each of us deserve that. And then finally, before I turn over the floor to our first speaker, there are a couple of people that have been really instrumental in making this happen in the back scenes that I just want to acknowledge. So Teresa Gagnon, who we're going to hear from in a moment, has been really instrumental in making this happen. Shauna Hurley, who works at IIE, has been instrumental in this. Kate Johnson is an IU alum and has been working really hard in the background to connect all our dots and make things happen. And Isaiah Green has also been working in the background to help get set up our digital toolbox, and he'll be getting things up online for us. And Jonathan Van Hecke, who set up the whole Zoom system. So thank you so much to all of you who've been working really hard to make this happen. And of course, Tarian, thank you. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn the stage over to Teresa Gagnon to kick off the seminar. Teresa is a program officer in the USA Study Abroad branch of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. You can read her full bio in the link in the chat. Teresa, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ellie. Appreciate that introduction and those really important notes, especially to focus on today's seminar. I think I am guilty of far too often trying to multitask and not really being able to be present. So that's definitely one of my goals throughout this series. I appreciate that reminder. I just want to echo what Ellie shared and Tarian as a huge warm welcome to you all and a thanks for joining the first Gilman Foreign Policy in Focus virtual seminar series on refugees and migration. We are very thankful to our hosts at Indiana University for putting this program together, and I really look forward to learning along with you. As mentioned, my name is Teresa Gagnon, and I'm a program officer in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the Department of State. I have the great privilege of working on the Gilman program, which is partnering with Indiana University for the seminar series. I'm thrilled in particular to welcome all of the Gilman scholars and alumni who are participating in today's seminar, and the many advisors and faculty members who support them throughout the year. And for those of you who don't know, the Gilman program provides outstanding U.S. undergraduate students who receive federal Pell Grant funding with scholarships to study and intern abroad. Since the program's inception in 2001, more than 38,000 Gilman scholars of diverse backgrounds from all U.S. states and territories have studied and interned in over 150 countries. In 2001, the Gilman program was happy to celebrate its 20th anniversary, but unfortunately it did so at a time when the global pandemic made it nearly impossible for American students to study abroad. Forced to think in creative ways to continue our mission, we developed the Gilman Foreign Policy in Focus virtual seminars with the goal of bringing the world closer, as well as building deeper connections between Americans and key U.S. foreign policy priorities. Our inaugural seminar series, which was launched last year, focused on the climate crisis and environmental sustainability. And this year, we will be exploring the critical issues of refugees and migration. As Secretary Blinken recently said, we are living through a period in the world where we have more people on the move, displaced from their homes, than at any time in recorded history. We have more than 100 million people around the world. By participating in the seminar series, we hope that you will all walk away with a deeper understanding of the social, political, economic, and environmental forces shaping global migration. We also hope to provide ideas on ways that you can contribute to solving these challenges. And before we get started with today's program, I would like to give a huge thanks to our colleagues at Indiana University, Dr. Ellie Cohen and Dr. Tarian Webb, who together with our Gilman program partner at the Institute of International Education, Shauna Hurley, have been working tirelessly over the past several months to organize a seminar series on a topic that is so important to all of us. I would also like to give a huge thanks to Indiana University's Dr. Nick Colither and Dr. Hannah Buxbaum for taking the time to join us as we launch this series. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic back over to you, Ellie.
Great. Thank you so much, Teresa, for that warm welcome, and my apologies for mispronouncing your last name. It's now my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Nick Colither, a historian of U.S. Foreign Relations and the current dean of the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies here at Indiana University.
Thank you, Ellie, Torian, and Teresa for hosting this wonderful series. I want to welcome everyone to this seminar series. We're very glad to have you joining us here in Bloomington virtually. The Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University is extremely pleased to be hosting this series of virtual events, which aligns so well with our history and our mission. Here at Hamilton Lugar, we teach 68 languages, which is more than any other American university. Indiana University's focus, its historic focus on global issues and its welcoming approach toward refugees has really benefited this part of the country. And Indiana University in many ways is an illustration of how refugees can transform a community. Over the last 10 years, IU has provided scholarships for migrants fleeing the repressive regime in Myanmar. And those students became the nucleus for a refugee community that grew to 12,000 people and that revitalized the town of Southport, Indiana, just north of here. Today, Indiana University is sponsoring 34 refugee scholars from Ukraine. And we recently aided in the resettlement of 7,200 Afghan refugees who passed through Camp Atterbury. The Hamilton Lugar School is deeply committed to the study of internationalism and international law. We offer the only undergraduate degree in international law in the United States. As you will learn in this seminar, many of the great innovations in international law and institutions, such as the concept of asylum and the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, originated in efforts to address this difficult issue. Migration, forced or otherwise, has many impacts. On a national and international level, it affects politics, economics, society, culture, and more. On a human level, it affects individuals who face the challenges of resettlement, of navigating systems of refugee protection and governance, while dealing with cultural and linguistic challenges. Here at Hamilton Lugar, we believe that the first step to changing the world is seeking to understand it. In fact, understanding the macro and micro dynamics of migration can lead to furthering of human rights, global governance, peace, and tolerance. We're hoping that through this series, you'll increase your knowledge about refugee issues and find ways to make a meaningful difference in the lives of refugees. Again, welcome virtually to Indiana.
Thank you so much, Nick, for these thoughtful and impactful words. So I would now like to turn the stage over to Professor Hannah Buxbaum, a professor at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law and the sitting vice president for international affairs at Indiana University. Hannah, please come.
Thanks, Tarian. So let me begin by joining everyone else in thanking Ellie, Tarian, and of course our colleagues at the State Department for sponsoring the seminar series. Like everyone else, I hope very much that all of the participants really learn a lot and also think about ways they can find personally, you can find personally to contribute to solving some of these challenges. So I'll just say a word about the Office of International Affairs here at Indiana University. So the office oversees all of the study abroad programs across IU's 7 campuses, and also manages recruitment, enrollment, and importantly, international student services for the nearly 8,000 international students that we have enrolled at our university. And you know, when I think about how we all should move toward contributing to solving the challenges that the current crises are creating, you know, it's really not only a question of learning, but a pragmatic question of what are the pathways that each of us can find in our own personal situation and in our own professional context to really make some meaningful difference in the lives and situation of refugees here. And in the case of IU, that means providing effective support for refugees in the context of our work in higher education. So we actually have over 40 identified refugee and asylee students enrolled on our Bloomington campus alone. And for refugees who come to the United States at a time that has disrupted their own educational pathway, you know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to provide them with meaningful support. And it is in some very technical and again, pragmatic ways, like helping them reconstruct their educational credentials that they earned in their home countries, helping them find affordable living situations, helping them navigate the incredibly complex immigration system to figure out how to get into the asylee pathway if that is what they're doing, or find other ways to help move them into status in the United States. And so at IU, what we have done is establish a task force whose goal is to work with individual refugee students and help them find the complete ecosystem of support that they need to be successful in their educational work. And this has been, it has really deployed, I think, the skills and experience of our staff members in new ways. So instead of working with U.S. study abroad students and recruiting, students to come to us from particular countries around the world, turning that experience to this goal of really assisting refugee students. It also takes, a tremendous amount of, to be frank, fundraising activity and connecting through to financial resources in various ways. And I think, again, everyone's professional context is different, but we need to look for those ways to turn our work toward this important challenge. In higher education, we will be dealing with this challenge for the foreseeable future. As Nick mentioned, there's the wave of refugees from Afghanistan, from Ukraine, but this is something we're seeing from multiple areas of the world, and will continue to do so. So making it a, if I can say, routine and expected part of all of our work, that we tend to the challenges of refugees in the normal work we're doing, I think is tremendously important. So I join everyone else again in saying, we hope you find this seminar series really enriching, and that you do start to, or continue finding the pathways to make a meaningful difference in the lives of these people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Nick and Teresa, for getting us started on the seminar series. So to start, what I want to do is define some of our terms so that we are all on the same page. We've been talking a lot about refugees, migrants. What is a refugee? And I invite you to go ahead and find the chat and let us know, what is a refugee, or how is a refugee defined? Any ideas here? Someone seeking refuge, absolutely. UNHCR definition, perfect, that's what I'm going to get into. A person displaced from their homeland. Great, so Betty hit the nail on the head, someone who's fled their country due to danger. Betty hit the nail on the head with the UNHCR definition. That's what I want to introduce briefly today, and we'll kind of dive further into later in the series. So according to UNHCR, which is the UN agency mandated to protect and support and assist refugees, a refugee is someone who's outside of their home country, right? So they've left their country. They're unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin, specifically because they have a well-founded fear of persecution because of these 5 things: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. So let's see. So we've got refugee, right? We just went over that definition. We'll also be talking about internally displaced people. Does anyone want to tell us in the chat what an internally displaced person is? Displaced within their country of origin. Perfect. Someone who's been forced to flee their home but never cross an international border. Absolutely. And then we can talk about this kind of broad category of people who have been displaced as forcibly displaced persons. And what we'll see in a couple slides is, according to the UNHCR, the UN agency, their data on forcibly displaced persons includes refugees, IDPs, asylum seekers, and Venezuelans abroad. I do want to say about the UNHCR refugee definition. Next week, we'll have more of an opportunity to kind of dive into thinking about what that definition means and who is included in that legal definition and who might be left out. So as I mentioned, UNHCR is the primary agency that is mandated to protect and assist refugees. And we'll be talking about UNHCR a lot over the course of this series. But I also want to make sure that we are familiar with UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, because UNRWA works to assist Palestinian refugees. And you'll see in the next slides why that is important to know. So this shows us some kind of broad data about our numbers, right? How many people have been forced to flee? So you can see from 2012 to 2022, those numbers have increased dramatically. And today, these numbers have reached 103 million. And I'll say the latest available estimates come from mid-2022, right? So, so these are not completely up to date, but these are the numbers that UNHCR has at the moment. So of that 103 million, 32.5 million of those people, displaced people, are considered refugees that fall under UNHCR's mandate. And you can see here too how that number has increased over time. And we can see how between 2021 and the first half of 2022, there have been 10 million new refugees just within that 6-month period. So we can imagine how that's going to grow by the end of 2022. And then this is the number of IDPs. Unfortunately, we don't have updated data from 2022, but we can see in 2021, there were 53.2 million IDPs. And so again, we can see how this number has grown over time. And also, I think it's important to point out that the number of IDPs is larger than the number of refugees, right? But the way that IDPs are supported is a little bit more complicated because UNHCR technically has a mandate to support only those with refugee status. And while they do provide a lot of support to IDPs in their home countries, it's more complicated, and we can get into that next week. So I also like to point out where refugees live, right? So here we can see that 83% of refugees in 2021 were hosted in low and middle income countries. And 72% of refugees are hosted in neighboring countries, right? And so this is important as we think about the hosting countries of refugees and the resources that they are able to provide to the large influxes of refugees, and the responsibility that high-income countries like the United States might have to contribute and to share in that responsibility, right? And I think it's important to note that most people are going to their neighboring countries, right? So if we think about where refugee situations are taking place and where they're going, they're not largely coming to the United States or to Canada or to Australia or Europe. They're really staying largely in these low and middle income countries that really do need additional support in order to support the refugees within their borders. And so we can dive a little deeper into where refugees are going and where they come from. And we can see here that 72% of today's refugees come from just 5 countries, right? They come from Syria, from Venezuela, from Ukraine, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. And where are these refugees going? Well, 36% of refugees are in these 5 countries, and these are the countries with the the 5 largest refugee populations, right? So we have Syrian refugees in Turkey. We have Colombia hosting primarily Venezuelans. Germany hosts about 1 million Ukrainian refugees, and then refugees from other countries. Pakistan hosts primarily Afghan refugees, and Uganda hosts refugees largely from South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I also want to note that while Turkey hosts the largest number of refugees by the number, by 3.7 million, another way we can think about refugee populations is per capita. Yep, and someone just, I see this comment in the chat that I thought Lebanon hosted a large percent of refugees. They do. In terms of the percentage, the per capita percentage, Lebanon hosts the largest percentage of refugees per capita. And I forget exactly what the number is, if it's I think it's 1 out of every 3 people in Lebanon are refugees. Someone can Google that and post that in the chat for us. But there are different ways that we can think about these numbers. And also, I want to point out that these numbers are all based on data that UNHCR has and doesn't include people who have fled their country but perhaps have not registered with UNHCR, right? So that's a whole other thing that we may get into in future weeks. So when someone flees their country and becomes a refugee, what does their life look like? And of course, we're going to get much deeper into this over the course of this series. But in broad strokes, we often imagine refugee situations like this, right? In these refugee camps, living in tents, often in these kind of desertous areas, right? We might imagine limited resources, UNHCR officials providing aid. And these images often, or these ideas often give us an image of refugees as these really helpless victims, right? Who are just sitting in these tents waiting. And I hope one of the things you'll learn over this series is that that's not true, right? That refugees are really active agents in their own lives, making decisions every day about what they're going to do, how they're going to live. But also, according to recent data, only 22% of refugees actually live in camps. Most refugees today are considered urban refugees, right? And that means that they live in cities and towns physically integrated among local populations, right? So they're not necessarily in these camps, but they are in cities. And each of these scenarios, right, both camp-based refugees and urban refugees have different experiences and opportunities, as well as different challenges, much of which we are going to get into in later seminars in this series. And see how I'm doing this? Now you guys all have to come back to keep learning with us what these challenges are. But you can imagine that living in camps and living in urban areas in a refugee situation with limited rights, limited or no pathways to citizenship can be, difficult to say the least. So what are the options once someone becomes a refugee, right? They live in a camp, they live in an urban area. What do? Where do they go from there? So UNHCR and the global community have outlined what we call durable solutions, the 3 possible solutions for refugees. And they are return, also known as repatriation, right, which is returning to your country of origin. So if you are a Ukrainian refugee, you flee during the war, and then at some point, the hope is that Ukraine becomes safe enough that you can return to Ukraine. In recent years, we know that the nature of conflict has changed, and wars and conflict are lasting much, much, much longer. And so those possibilities for repatriation have become smaller. A second option is resettlement, And that is when a refugee who is in a country of asylum, right, while they're waiting in this sort of limbo period, they could be resettled to a third country, like the United States, like Canada, like Australia, right? And when they come to these countries, like the United States, they're here with a pathway to citizenship. And the third option is local integration, where refugees stay in their country of asylum and become integrated into that community, ideally with a pathway to citizenship, right? So they can have full rights and full opportunities. In the next weeks, we're going to talk more about the challenges and the limitations of these solutions. And without getting too deep into it, because we are going to talk about this later, I do want to highlight that in the past year, only around 200,000 refugees accessed a durable solution. Well, I should say they accessed repatriation or resettlement, right? So we can see about 160,000 refugees were repatriated and 42,000 refugees were resettled. That is less than 1% of the global refugee population, right? So that means that the majority of refugees live in a country of asylum with limited pathways for citizenship. And in fact, research shows that a refugee remains in a country of asylum for an average of 17 years. So while we often think about those asylum periods as temporary, right? The refugees who are in countries like Turkey, we saw Germany, we saw Uganda in that list, right? We think about that as temporary, but the reality is that they end up living there for a much longer time. And so, yeah. So I'm going to actually stop there. And I hope this gave you a basic but broad understanding of the global displacement situation. And I hope that you will join us for future seminars to learn more, to get more into detail on these issues. I see a lot of questions coming into the chat, which is great. And what we're going to do, I'm going to turn it over to our last speaker, and then we'll have time to go through some of those questions when she is finished. So I am thrilled to turn the stage over to Paula Lynch, the Director of the Office of Policy and Resources Planning in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the U.S. Department of State. In her role, Paula is responsible for the strategy, policy, planning, and analysis that underlies PRM's humanitarian budget. So her office covers policies including protection for refugees, conflict victims, stateless persons, education, cash and voucher assistance, and promoting coherence among humanitarian and development programs. Paula, I'm not ready for you yet. I've got a longer introduction because she's amazing. She spent her career connected to humanitarian assistance, whether serving at the Department of State and PRM, the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, or in the Office of the U.S. Foreign Assistance. She's served overseas at the U.S. Mission in Geneva, the U.S. Embassy in Kigali, Rwanda, and an extended temporary duty assistance to Kampala, Uganda, related to fraud and refugee registration. Paula has also received multiple awards, including an award for her work on behalf of refugee women, for achievements as the elected rapporteur of the Executive Committee of UNHCR, and as one of the founding members of PRM's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Council. So Paula, thank you so much for all the work that you have done. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you very much. I am really happy to be here. I hope you don't hear my dogs barking in the background. They're behind a door, but they're making lots of noise. So I'm very sorry about that. I wanted to first say, I grew up in Bloomington, so it's really fun to be associated with this IU program. I felt like I went to IU for 18 years, and so I didn't end up going to college there, but I certainly do love Bloomington as a town and have lots of friends that are still there. I wanted to go back to World War II because I think it's important to understand a little bit about the history of how the US got to where it is. We are the leaders in humanitarian assistance, and it's not just because we have the most money. It's also that we have a huge depth of interest in the community of which you're a part, also in the Congress. There's a huge affinity and affiliation with humanitarian assistance. After World War II, I think a lot of countries realized that things hadn't gone so well on certain grounds, and humanitarian issues was one of the biggest ones. UN High Commissioner for Refugees was founded as an agency, and the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees was passed. As it was adopted, it only applied to Europe. It didn't apply to the rest of the world until 1967 with the protocol on refugees. But when it was passed, it required that countries take responsibility not to return a refugee to a place where they might be persecuted, and now since 1984, also where they might be tortured, because the Convention on Torture also has a non-refoulement, that's the French word for it, aspect to it. So the US ratified the protocol pretty soon after it was passed. We had not ratified the 51 Convention, which always strikes me as odd, since we did resettle a huge number of refugees from Europe after World War II. But we did ratify the protocol. It was during the war in Vietnam, and by 1975, we were withdrawing from Vietnam. And that ended up with the largest resettlement program that we've ever had to the United States. Over 1 million Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians were resettled here, and I think have done an extremely good job of contributing to American society and becoming American. I think, let's see. So that the resettlement program for Southeast Asia lasted more than 20 years. And by the end of it, we had the 1980 Refugee Act, the Refugee Act of 1980, which established a regular means of saying what we would do for resettlement programming. We would, every year, the president would announce what the ceiling is going to be, and then we would resettle people. We would have a allocation by region so that we know where people are going to be coming from. And that has worked pretty well up to the current time. Now, I skipped right over something I didn't mean to skip over, and that was in 1962, Congress passed the Migration and Refugee Assistance Act, what we call the MRA, which is the act that gives us our funding every year for PRM programming. PRM is my Bureau, Population, Refugees, and Migration. Our funding is used for 3 agencies that are mentioned by name in the legislation. That is UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the International Organization for Migration. Those 3 have sort of first dibs on our funding. We fund their programs, not completely, but we fund a good chunk toward them every year. And then we also fund other international organizations. UNRWA is one of the big ones, and also UNICEF, although we're not the only funder of UNICEF. There are others that fund it. Same with IOM. We're not the only funder of IOM either. For international, for the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, there's a legal underpinning for that, just as there is the convention for UNHCR. ICRC implements the international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, also called the law of war. That describes how war is to be carried out, which doesn't sound very humane in description, but there's a particular section that is on civilians in armed conflict and what is allowable with civilians and what is not allowable. So we fund ICRC to help out in conflict to make sure that civilians are treated the way that is acceptable in a war situation. It's always very difficult to say that without sounding like you're contradicting yourself. I know. So the US has international legal obligations if we're conducting a war, but we also help deal with the situation that might be faced elsewhere where ICRC is present. I think it might be useful to skip now and talk a little bit about funding so you get an idea of how much money we have, and then also to talk about some of the issues that are newer that we're dealing with. I can go back to our fiscal 22 funding levels. And I will say that the PRM funding is less than half of the total humanitarian assistance that's available, but we do fund 100% of UNHCR and ICRC funding and UNRWA as well. So the refugee funding overseas is primarily done by us. USAID also has humanitarian funding, and because they fund food assistance, they also are covering refugees for food assistance and sometimes for cash programming, cash and voucher assistance. But I wanted to say that in FY22, the Bureau obligated, that is almost spent, made a commitment to provide funding that almost reached $5.5 billion. And of that, more than 4.5 billion, that is 82%, was for overseas assistance. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit, because that is the main part of what we spend our funding on. The region with the largest amount of funding going to it was the Middle East, the Near East. It's always been difficult to figure out when you're looking at refugees and populations and funding, how to determine whether it's got more money because it's more expensive or it got more money because there are more people. And I will tell you that after several decades of working on this, I've never come up with a perfect formula to figure that out. But the Near East has a lot of refugees, particularly Syrians now, and it also got about a third of our funding. Africa, that has the most refugees of any continent, but again, continents aren't all the same size, so but anyway, and it's also, I think it's still the poorest continent. It has 27% of our funding last year. So there was quite a bit. Africa is $1.2 billion worth of assistance that just PRM gave. USAID also gave a lot of assistance in Africa as well. The Western Hemisphere got 13% last year of our funding, but it's going to grow a lot this year because, as you, I think, have been talking about and know, we're engaging very strongly to try to deal with the migration flows in this hemisphere. East Asia and Asia, I'm not sure how to define those two separately. They 12% for the two regions. That's a very large set of countries. The Rohingya in Bangladesh are probably the largest population, except for the Afghans, which, although many have fled and are still leaving Afghanistan, and we are still resettling people, there is still a lot of need inside Afghanistan, but unfortunately not a country that is an easy one to deal with the Taliban in charge. So that's the funding. Let me talk a little bit about some of the issues that we have. If I'm running out of time, you just have to interrupt me and tell me that. You saw a slide that showed that less than 1% of refugees are resettled in any year. That's always been true. It's not a durable solution that everybody gets. It's very hard to make that happen for everybody. So don't get your head around we're going to resettle everybody. It's not going to happen. But we are very pleased that we're resettling more and more, and that it is being made available to people who, particularly people who don't have other options, who either can't go home or can't stay where they are. For people that are stuck, if you will, in protracted situations, that is, they're in asylum, they've got permission to stay in that country, but not forever. They're, if they are given citizenship, or if they're given permanent residence, like a green card would be if in this country, then that would be considered a durable solution. But most are not. Most countries say, well, okay, we'll let you stay here for a while, but we're not going to do this forever. In those cases where the Global Compact on Refugees that was adopted 2 years ago in the General Assembly called for refugee inclusion. So it means that rather than have a separate health facility just for refugees, for example, you would have it for refugees and the host community. And in some cases, there will be some humanitarian funding going into that. But in other cases, you may have development funding or the country's own resources coming into that. That's something we're working very hard on and have had a lot of good conversations and good programming with the World Bank also. And so that's very promising to try to get to a more normal situation for people that are in a situation that is not going anywhere. And that's, I'm sorry, that's a very blunt way of saying it, but it's true. We also have the issue that was raised about camp and non-camp refugees. I just want to remind that it's not camp or a city. There are a lot of refugees that don't live in camp situations anymore, but they're in a rural setting. Maybe they're farmers. In Uganda, there are lots and lots of refugees that are not in cities or towns, but they are in rural areas and they're not in camps. We also have the issue of climate change and migration. It's not that a sudden tornado creates refugees. It's that as climate changes, it's going to make some places uninhabitable. The easiest thing to think about is countries in the South Pacific, islands in the South Pacific. There are several that look like in some point in the future, those islands are going to be underwater. And so those people are going to need some place to go. Australia has been extremely forward-looking in terms of making arrangements and offering to help out as needed. I'm not sure if they're calling it asylum. I don't know enough about it, but there are going to be other areas in the world that will have sufficient climate damage that they'll need to be able to have another option available. We don't call them climate refugees. We say it's climate change and migration, or the effects of climate change on migration, because refugees really does still pertain to persecution, and persecution happens from other people. It doesn't happen from climate. So, but believe me, there's not a difference in the importance of dealing with it. It's just a difference in the terms. So my last thing is that there's a real energy now around data and around trying to do better analysis of situations that people are in, trying to figure out what would be the best way to cope with whatever the situations are that are difficult for them to live in, and then try to figure out what the right answer is, rather than thinking that all you need is, just get a tent in there and that kind of thing. So we're trying very hard to do better analysis, to better inform what kind of assistance we can provide. I will say that 20 years ago, we persuaded UNHCR to stop giving us a budget that they thought they could fund completely and start giving us needs-based budgets so that we knew what the total challenge was. Those needs-based budgets are out there, but they're not fully funded. And we can't fund them all ourselves, but we are doing, I would say, everybody would probably admit we're doing a better job than any other country. And the EU is the closest one to us. And Germany has changed so much since I first started working on this. Germany was hardly interested in humanitarian assistance when I first started working on it. And now they are the number 2 donor behind us. So that's just amazing to me that it changed so much, but to the better. So
in our next seminar, we'll be joined by Dr. Rawan Arar, who will talk to us more about the system of refugee protection and governance globally. And she'll get much more into that 1951 convention and the definition of refugees, and explore some of the successes and challenges of these systems. On June 15th, we will dive into 3 different case studies. We'll hear from Amali Tower about climate refugees. We'll hear from Mark Okello Oyat and Sahara Ismaili 2 refugees living in the Dadaab refugee camp who will talk to us about their work on education in the camp. And Tanya Bulach will talk to us about internally displaced people in Ukraine. In the following seminar, we're going to learn about the experiences of refugees who are resettled in the United States and Canada. And we'll hear from 3 refugees themselves about what that resettlement was like, as well as an expert who has worked, I believe, alongside Paula in some of that resettlement work at a government level. And then in the last seminar, we'll discuss ways that all of you can take action to support refugees, whether that's in a volunteer capacity, in an internship, or as a profession.